Welcome to our September Planet Possible MiniPod. I'm Niki Roach, and this is a monthly update where we react to current events in water, climate and nature. And it's a MiniPod because it'll only take about 15 minutes of your time, and it means you get a Planet Possible episode every 2 weeks. Each MiniPod, I'm joined by an environmental expert, and we explore 3 issues that are making the headlines and keeping you right up to date with what's happening around the world, and where my guest sees some exciting possibilities. And this MiniPod, my guest is a familiar voice to many, the Director of Policy at CIWEM, Chisholm, and we'll be talking about what the appointment of a new Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Reynolds, might mean for the water environment, who should be responsible for hosepipe bans, and sponge cities. Do we need to change the way we talk about the environment we want in the future? So, in early September, we saw a change in the leadership of DEFRA, with Reynolds MP being appointed as the new Secretary of State. There have been a huge amount of reviews undertaken into water over the last 12 months or so. So, as Policy Director, give us a quick reminder of where we are and what Emma is inheriting.
Her background is Treasury. She's also played a role in the Housing Department before. So I think what we would expect to see is really very much a doubling down on the growth narrative that we have. That's been pretty strong up until this point under the current government. We've seen that to date with Steve Reed. But I think, if anything, that will be stronger. So what that means for what is coming in the autumn will be very interesting to look at. You mentioned there's been a few reviews. Now, people are talking about the Cunliffe review, but there's actually been quite a lot more, looking beyond 2025 explicitly. But I made a little bit of a note because we're going to be putting out an update to our Freshwater Future report this autumn, and I looked back to about 2023. House of Lords Regulators Committee did a review into water regulation by Ofwat. This year alone, the Environment Agency put out its pollution incident report, which pointed towards a 60% increase in serious pollution incidents and a 60% decrease in reporting of those by water companies, which is really not the kind of trend that we want to see. The House of Commons Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee published a report on priorities for water sector reform after some inquiry sessions. The National Audit Office did a report on regulation for investment and outcomes in the water industry. The House of Commons Public Accounts Committee did a report and an inquiry on water sector regulation in a less official capacity. But I think it's really important to point to this because it was an interesting piece of work. There was a People's Commission on the water sector, which was run sort of in parallel with the Independent Water Commission, that's the Cunliffe Review. And the reason that was done is because there were stakeholders out there who thought that really the Cunliffe Review was a little bit too close to the water industry itself and wasn't considering the full range of issues, particularly things like public ownership of companies and changing the ownership model. That wasn't the only thing that it looked at, but it did put forward some really quite strong arguments around various pieces. And I think it's important for the sector not to ignore that. It's really reflective of a lot of the frustration and the anger that there is out there amongst stakeholders. So there's been a raft of reviews, including Cunliffe. What Emma Reynolds, as Secretary of State, has to do, and her department, is really, really quickly decide what they're going to do with all of this feedback. And it's been strong feedback on the state of the sector, the state of the water system management as a whole. And we're told this autumn, at some point, there will be a white paper, a water white paper. There will be some kind of announcements around the reconfiguration of a new water regulator, so reconfiguration of the existing Environment Agency, Drinking Water Inspectorate and Ofwat into something, a super regulator for the water sector. And there may be some new strategic guidance for Ofwat. Now, how ambitious, what we would define as ambitious, those might be, I think will be quite informed by Emma Reynolds' worldview. All will be revealed in due course, I guess. And a lot of that material is what we're going to be chewing through in our Freshwater Future conference, which is going to happen on the 2nd of December in London. What all those reviews mean, what the government response either is or might be, because we don't know if it will be out by that point. And really the emphasis that we're looking at is how do we make progress by 2029? Because a lot of these reviews have been looking longer term than that. And actually what's really important is that we can get to a point by the next election, or it's important for the government to get to a point by the next election that people can see some meaningful progress.
I like the plug for a Freshwater Future Conference. I'm all here for that. That's absolutely great. We'll pop links to that in the show notes. Okay, let's move on from the business of government a little bit and talk about, I guess, climate and drought in particular, which is obviously in the headlines. So earlier on this year, the Environment Agency convened its National Drought Group to discuss the dry weather. And as a reminder, if we need it, we've had the driest spring in 50 years and the warmest summer on record in England. And we've got hosepipe bans currently in England affecting 8.5 million people across much of the south and up here, where I am in Yorkshire. Should it be down to water companies, Al, to impose hosepipe bans, given that they're not responsible for all the water in the environment?
This is a really interesting question, Niki, because earlier in the summer, there was a little bit of jostling for position at the top of the good behaviour league by water companies, some of whom were saying we're not going to need to put on hosepipe bans. And personally, I found that messaging a little bit challenging in that it probably wasn't putting out a clear message to water customers that when you're facing this kind of dry weather, drought conditions potentially, it's good to get on the front foot with just using water wisely. The way in which hosepipe bans are applied, there's a sequence to it. So the Environment Agency will identify areas of the country which are officially in drought status. But that doesn't necessarily mean that a water company in that area has to put on a hosepipe ban. Ultimately, they will make an assessment on what their water resources are looking like and whether or not they need to put a hosepipe ban on due to pressures. And if they do, it might not be for their whole patch either. It might just be for a small bit of it. And that decision-making process is really driven by their statutory responsibilities, which are mainly for public water supply and the security of that supply. Now, earlier in the summer, the Environment Agency launched its National Framework for Water Resources, which is kind of the set of principles really that inform how it wants water companies to plan for the future, and also wider sectors, increasingly so. And it made a big play of the fact that there are water demands in our economy from things like data centres, energy generation, agriculture, which are going to increase in future. They're going to add to that 5 billion litres of water a day that we're going to need to find for public water supply by 2050. And that cross-sector, multi-sector picture is increasingly relevant. So my question, I guess, is, given that actually demand management by customers can unlock, and we've seen this year, decent savings, around 10%, I think, some of the companies that have put hosepipe bans on and have been communicating that they're going to put hosepipe bans on, shouldn't we be doing that really quite early so that agriculture gets a bit more benefit from less demand on water resources, so that nature in rivers does, and so on? Water companies just aren't driven to do that, whereas an organisation like the Environment Agency might be much more because they've got that wider remit. So I'm not saying it definitely shouldn't be water companies who announce hosepipe bans, and it definitely should be the Environment Agency. But I think, as we move into a natural phase of identifying lessons that from this summer, maybe that is something that Emma Reynolds, as the new Secretary of State, might want to reflect on. Let's
talk about sponge cities, which is a term that listeners may not have heard of. So I know this is on your mind a little bit at the moment. Give me a quick 30-second. What is a sponge city? Why are you thinking about them at the moment, Al?
So sponge cities are really associated with China. That's where the concept originated. Dozens of cities now have been designed as sponge cities. They can do it from very much a sort of a master plan perspective. And in China, they get really, really bad flash flooding. One of the ways in which they can mitigate those effects is to build in sponginess into these brand new urban landscapes that they're building. So they've got big storage ponds, natural wetlands, a lot of sustainable drainage systems in the streets and so on. And that model has gradually percolated out across the world. We see those kind of impacts, albeit at a lesser degree of extremity to places like China, but we see them in the UK, and we've got a dense population and people do get flooded very easily from summer downpours and so on. And there's a whole host of benefits on the water resources side as well if you can incorporate things like rainwater harvesting in it. But a lot of the language that we use when we're trying to direct developers to do things better, when we're talking about it in planning, when we're talking to the public about why we might want to put a rain garden in a street that's instead of a parking space, sustainable drainage systems and water reuse just all sounds very technocratic and impenetrable a lot of the time to a lot of people. Whereas sponge cities, I think, is a concept that people can grasp. Personally, in the UK context, I'm not so keen on just the use of sponge cities. We have an awful lot of urban areas that aren't cities, and I would hate for the metropolitan elite living in our cities to get all of the sponginess and no one else. So I think we need sponge landscapes, we need sponge towns, we need sponge villages. But what we want to do through a Sponge Cities UK campaign is just make this concept a little bit easier to appreciate. Do quite a lot of show and tell of good practice. Explain to parliamentarians, wider stakeholders that there is economic benefit in building in this resilience, that it can be a growth enabler, and do some of the policy related thinking and help support some of the policy related thinking that can just get these kind of measures, some of which, you know, we have talked about some of the SUDS legislation, for example, before, I think on this podcast, and as an organisation, we write an awful lot of opinion pieces on it. Some of this stuff has taken 15 years to not get implemented. We need to look at things a little bit differently, make it feel less kind of scary, less like red tape and bureaucracy, and something that just feels a lot more like common sense.
And also some really obvious questions like, who is going to own these things? We just need to be clear about that. And if we know who owns these things and who's going to look after these things and who's going to protect the integrity of the sponginess, then people can get on and do it. I think there's just a lot of uncertainty, isn't there? So I think I'm delighted that it's something you're thinking about, and sounds like you're going to do a bit more sharing on. So look forward to seeing that. Al, as ever, time flies on these mini pods. I could talk to you for ages, but that is all we have time for. And thanks to you for joining us on the mini pod as well. You can subscribe to Planet Possible wherever you get your podcasts to never miss an episode. And we've got more fantastic guests and topics lined up for the rest of this year, so I do hope you'll join us for those. That's it, everyone. Stay curious, stay connected, and we'll see you next time.